The overhead projector whirred, casting a pale, trembling rectangle of light onto the beige wall of the community clubhouse. A diagram of a modest garden shed, rendered in Mark Calloway's precise architectural hand, flickered within the frame. It was a simple structure, well under the square footage limit, designed to blend seamlessly with the aesthetic of his home and the surrounding properties in the pristine, meticulously governed enclave of Summit Creek. "As you can see," Mark began, his voice calm and even, a professional habit honed over 2 decades of client presentations. "The proposed materials are reclaimed cedar siding and a standing seam metal roof in charcoal gray, consistent with the palette approved in the Architectural Control Committee's published guidelines. The footprint is minimal, and its placement at the rear of the property ensures it will not be visible from the street." He was here as a courtesy. His property, a sprawling acre at the edge of the development, predated the Summit Creek Homeowners Association by a good 30 years. Technically, he wasn't bound by their rules, but he believed in being a good neighbor. A simple presentation to the ACC was a small gesture of goodwill, a way to maintain the peace. 3 of the 5 committee members nodded, their expressions ranging from placid interest to mild boredom. They were volunteers, neighbors who had signed up to debate the merits of slate versus asphalt shingles and the acceptable shades of taupe for front doors. But the 4th member, the one seated at the head of the long folding table, was not nodding. Brenda Holloway, president of the Summit Creek HOA Board of Directors, tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the glossy cover of a 3-ring binder. Her platinum blonde hair was sculpted into an unflappable helmet, and a faint, chemical scent of hairspray and ambition radiated from her. She wasn't just a volunteer, she was a ruler, and this clubhouse was her throne room. "That's all very interesting, Mark," she said, her voice a smooth, dangerous purr that cut through the room's stale air. She didn't look at the shed plans. Her gaze was fixed on him, sharp and vaguely predatory. "But I believe we have a more pressing architectural matter to discuss regarding your property." Mark paused, the pointer in his hand hovering over the diagram. "I'm sorry." Brenda smiled, a tight, unpleasant gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "Your garden," she said, letting the word hang in the air, "and the unapproved fence surrounding it. The one you installed along the common area." A confused murmur rippled through the dozen or so homeowners seated in the audience. This wasn't on the agenda. Mark felt a prickle of irritation. He had spent the last week ensuring his shed presentation was flawless, a model of neighborly cooperation. This felt like an ambush. "Brenda, my vegetable garden is on my property," he stated, keeping his tone level, "and the fence is a simple, 2-foot-high decorative border. It's hardly a structure that requires ACC approval." "That," Brenda said, leaning forward, "is a matter of interpretation. That strip of land abuts the community's primary view corridor. We have bylaws about that. Very specific bylaws." She was enjoying this. The public stage, the sudden shift in focus, the subtle humiliation of a man who, until now, had remained politely outside her sphere of influence. Mark could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, their curiosity piqued. He was being made an example of. He decided to meet the challenge with his own brand of precision. Which bylaw would that be? "Brenda, could you cite the specific article and section?" The question caught her off guard. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She began to flip through her binder, the rustle of plastic page protectors echoing in the quiet room. The other committee members shifted uncomfortably. "It's in the CC&Rs," she said, waving a dismissive hand as if the exact location were a trivial detail. "The point is, Mark, you can't just build whatever you want, wherever you want. There are rules." For everyone. Her implication was clear, especially for you. The meeting had been successfully derailed. The shed was forgotten. The new agenda item, written in invisible ink, was Mark Calloway's insubordination. He looked at Brenda, at the rigid set of her jaw and the triumphant glint in her eyes, and understood with a cold, sinking clarity that this had nothing to do with a garden fence. This was personal, and it was just the beginning. Mark was, by nature, a man who believed in systems. He believed in blueprints, in stress calculations, in the logical progression from foundation to framework to finished structure. He believed that if the rules were clear and the materials sound, the result would be stable and just. His life was a testament to this philosophy. His architectural firm was successful, built on a reputation for meticulous detail and unwavering integrity. His home, a classic mid-century modern he had lovingly restored, was a sanctuary of clean lines and quiet order. His family was the core of that order. Sarah, his wife, was a landscape designer whose calm, nurturing presence was the soil in which their family grew. She balanced his rigid precision with an intuitive understanding of the world's organic, unpredictable beauty. Their 12-year-old daughter, Lily, was a bright, inquisitive girl who had inherited his eye for detail and her mother's love for the outdoors. Their life at Summit Creek was peaceful, insulated from the chaos of the city by acres of manicured green space and the comforting, if sometimes overbearing, hum of a well-run HOA. The source of the conflict, the 6-foot-wide, 50-foot-long strip of land, was where Mark's orderly world met Sarah's creative one. It ran along the edge of their property, bordering the vast, rolling expanse of the HOA's designated common area. For years, it had been a neglected patch of grass. Last spring, at Sarah's urging, they had transformed it. Together, the three of them had tilled the soil, planted neat rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers, and enclosed it with a low, tasteful fence of thin black metal posts and wire mesh, just enough to keep the rabbits out. Lily had painted a small, colorful sign that read, "The Calloway Patch." It was their little project, a shared space of sun and soil. To Mark, the property line was an absolute, a legally defined boundary recorded in the county assessor's office. His land was his land. But to Brenda Holloway, it seemed, boundaries were merely suggestions, to be redrawn at her convenience. After the public confrontation at the ACC meeting, Mark had assumed the issue might fade, a momentary power play that had served its purpose. He was wrong. A week later, the first official volley arrived. It wasn't a letter in a standard envelope. It was a courtesy notice, delivered via email from Keystone Management, the third-party company hired by the board to handle the HOA's day-to-day operations. The subject line read, "Notice of Potential Covenant Violation, 1280 Summit View Drive." The body of the email was polite but firm, a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression. Dear Mr. Calloway, this email serves as a courtesy notice regarding a potential violation of the Summit Creek covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs. It has been brought to the board's attention that an unapproved fence and garden installation exists on what is believed to be HOA common property, specifically within the designated view corridor adjacent to your lot. As per CC&R, Ferger 8.4.2, all community view corridors must remain unobstructed to preserve the aesthetic integrity and property values of the community. We request that you remove the aforementioned fence and plantings within 7 days to bring the area back into compliance. Failure to do so may result in a formal notice of violation being issued. Sincerely, Keystone Management, On behalf of the Summit Creek HOA Board of Directors. Mark read the email 3 times. Believed to be HOA common property. Far 8.4.2. The language was deliberately slippery, couched in terms of belief and potential, yet the threat was concrete. He printed the email and the attached copy of Far 8.4.2, which spoke in vague terms about maintaining unobstructed panoramic views from designated common areas. He then walked into his study and retrieved the thick file from his home's closing. Inside was the property survey, a crisp, detailed map with the boundary lines drawn in bold, unmistakable ink. The garden was, without a shadow of a doubt, 10 feet inside his property line. He drafted a calm, factual response to Keystone Management, attaching a scanned PDF of his survey. He explained the situation clearly and politely, pointing out that since the installation was entirely on his private property, CC&R 8.4.2 did not apply. He concluded by stating that he considered the matter resolved. He hit send and felt a sense of satisfaction. Logic, he believed, would prevail. The system would correct itself. That evening, Sarah looked over his shoulder at the email chain. A worried line creased her forehead. "Are you sure this is the best way?" "Mark, you saw how she was at that meeting. She's looking for a fight. Maybe we should just move the fence in a few feet just to appease her." "Appease her, Sarah. This is a matter of principle," he said, his voice tight with a frustration he was trying to contain. "It's our property. We can't let her bully us into giving up our own land because she's on some power trip. The survey is clear. It's over." But as the days ticked by with no response from Keystone Management, a knot of unease began to form in his stomach. The silence was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a clock being wound. The second notice arrived exactly 8 days later. This time, there was no email, no pretense of courtesy. It was a stark white envelope delivered by a mail carrier who required a signature, the certified mail receipt, with its green border and official tracking number. Felt like a summons. Inside, the letter was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock bearing the Summit Creek HOA's embossed logo. The tone had shifted from passively aggressive to actively hostile. Notice of violation. Date August 15, 2023. Property 1280. Summit View. Drive violation. Unapproved structure and landscaping on HOA common area. CC&R. Figure 8.4.2. Obstruction of view corridor. Description of violation. A fence and vegetable garden have been installed on the common area property adjacent to your lot, in direct violation of the governing documents of the Summit Creek Homeowners Association. Despite a courtesy notice issued on August 7, 2023, the violation has not been cured. Required action. You are hereby required to remove the unapproved fence and all non-compliant landscaping from the common area within 14 days of the date of this notice. The area must be returned to its original state grass turf. Consequences of non-compliance. Failure to cure this violation by the deadline will result in the levying of monetary fines, beginning at $100 per day, and may lead to a formal hearing before the Board of Directors, the placement of a lien against your property, and other legal remedies available to the association. The letter was signed not by the anonymous Keystone Management, but in a sharp, slanted script, Brenda Holloway, President, Summit Creek HOA Board. Mark stared at the letter, a cold fury rising in his chest. His logical, evidence-based rebuttal had been completely ignored. The survey, the proof, the facts, they meant nothing. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, formal assault. The crisp paper felt heavy in his hand. A declaration of war delivered directly to his doorstep. The system wasn't correcting itself. It was being weaponized against him. The peace he had so carefully cultivated was about to be shattered. Mark's first instinct was to fight fire with fire, to hire a lawyer and draft a blistering cease and desist letter. But Sarah, ever the voice of caution, urged a more measured approach. "Let's not escalate this to lawyers yet," she pleaded, her hand on his arm. "It's expensive, it's stressful, and it will make things in the neighborhood unbearable. Just try to talk to them one more time. Go to the management company in person. Show them the survey. Maybe this is all just a miscommunication that Brenda is blowing out of proportion." Reluctantly, Mark agreed. He still held a sliver of hope that the procedural gears of the HOA were run by reason, not by the whims of a single individual. The next morning, he drove to the sterile office park that housed Keystone Management. The office was a small, soulless space with gray carpeting and fluorescent lighting. A young, harried-looking man named David was the property manager assigned to Summit Creek. Mark laid the notice of violation and his property survey side by side on David's desk. "There's been a mistake," Mark said calmly. "My garden is on my property. This survey, which is a legally recorded document with the county, proves it. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. I need you to communicate this to the board and have this violation notice rescinded." David glanced at the survey, his eyes flicking nervously between the documents. He wouldn't make eye contact with Mark. "Well, Mr. Calloway," he began, clearing his throat, "our records, which are based on the community plat map the developer provided, indicate that area is a view corridor easement." "Then your plat map is being misinterpreted. Or it's wrong," Mark countered, tapping the survey. "This is the definitive document. It supersedes any informal map the HOA might be using." David sighed, a weary, defeated sound. He pushed the papers back across the desk. "Look, I'm just the messenger here. All official decisions come from the board. My hands are tied. President Holloway is very specific in her instructions." "Then let me speak to Brenda," Mark demanded. "I'll show her the survey myself. We can clear this up in 5 minutes." A flash of what looked like genuine pity crossed David's face. "She won't meet with you. She has a policy against meeting with homeowners privately regarding active violations. She says it ensures the process is fair and unbiased for everyone." The doublespeak was infuriating. The system wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to be a fortress. With Brenda safely ensconced inside, pulling the levers, Mark felt the walls closing in. He had presented irrefutable evidence to the designated authority, and they had refused to even look at it. He had been stonewalled, his recourse exhausted before it had even begun. He left the office with his survey in hand, the reality of the situation solidifying into a hard, cold knot in his stomach. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as Brenda intended. The 14-day deadline passed in a haze of anxiety. Every morning, Mark would look out the window at the small garden, a symbol of his family's quiet joy that had been twisted into a source of profound stress. On the 15th day, another email arrived from Keystone Management. Subject notice of fine assessment, 1280 Summit View Drive. Dear Mr. Calloway, as the violation cited in the notice of violation, dated August 15, 2023, has not been cured, a fine of $100 has been levied against your account. This fine will continue to be assessed on a daily basis until the property is brought into compliance. Your current balance is $100. The email was followed 2 days later by another certified letter, a notice of hearing. He was being summoned to appear before the board in 2 weeks' time to present his case. The letter outlined the potential outcomes, which included the formal validation of the daily fines and the authorization for the HOA's attorney to begin the process of placing a lien on his home. The official documents were piling up on his desk, a paper monument to Brenda's relentless campaign. The fines were climbing $200, $300, $400. It wasn't about the money. It was the principle. Each charge was an official endorsement of a lie, a daily declaration that his property was not his own. The system he had trusted had not only failed him, it had actively turned against him. It was time to stop trying to work within it. It was time to start investigating it. Mark Calloway was an architect. He built things. He understood that to construct something strong, you needed a solid foundation and a clear blueprint. Now, he realized, to dismantle something, you needed the very same things. Brenda's case against him was a structure, and he was determined to find its blueprints, expose its faulty foundation, and watch it collapse. His first step was to formalize his defense. He sent a written request to Keystone Management, citing the section of the HOA bylaws that guaranteed homeowners access to official records. He asked for a complete, unredacted copy of the minutes from all board meetings over the past year, along with any and all records pertaining to the landscaping and maintenance of the common areas. The response was telling. A week later, he received a thick packet in the mail. The meeting minutes were there, but they were a sea of black ink. Entire paragraphs and financial figures were redacted. A cover letter from David explained that the redactions were necessary to protect vendor privacy and attorney-client privilege. The section in the minutes from the month before his violation, under the heading Landscape Contract Renewals, was almost entirely blacked out. It was a blatant act of obstruction. And, for Mark, it was the first sign of a structural flaw. Why would a routine landscaping contract require such secrecy? This was no longer a one-man job. He needed someone who knew how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of public records, someone who could see through the bureaucratic smoke and mirrors. He called George Maxwell. George was a retired county clerk in his late 60s, a man whose entire professional life had been dedicated to the meticulous organization of public information. He and Mark had become friends years ago while working together on a complex zoning variance for a commercial project. George possessed a bloodhound's nose for paperwork and a deep, abiding disdain for petty tyrants who abused procedure. Over coffee at a small diner far from Summit Creek, Mark laid out the stack of notices and the redacted minutes. George adjusted his bifocals, his brow furrowing as he read. Classic Stonewall. George grunted, tapping the blacked-out page. Vendor privacy is what they say when they don't want you to see the name or the dollar amount. They're hiding something in the budget. Mark, something connected to that common area. But how do we get the unredacted version? Mark asked. They're a private corporation. They'll claim the records are proprietary. George smiled. A sly, knowing grin. They are. But they also have to file certain documents with the county and the state to maintain their nonprofit status. And some communities have bylaws that require them to deposit a copy of all official meeting minutes with a local archive or library for transparency. Let me make a few calls. People who build walls with paper forget that paper always leaves a trail. While George began his archival deep dive, Mark focused on his own area of expertise: maps and surveys. He drove to the county records office and pulled the original master plat map for the entire Summit Creek development, filed by the developer back in the early 1990s. He spread the enormous blueprint across a lighted table. There, in faded blue ink, were the precise demarcations of every lot, every road, and every common area. He located his property, Lot 1 at the edge of the development. He traced the boundary line with his finger, the very line Brenda was contesting. And then he saw it. The plat map itself confirmed his survey was correct. But there was something else. A faint, dotted line running parallel to his property line, creating the very 6-foot-wide strip in question. Next to it was a notation, an abbreviation he didn't immediately recognize: C-U-E. It was this dotted line, he suspected, that Brenda was using as the basis for her claim. Meanwhile, the fines continued their relentless climb. The balance on his HOA account was now over $1,000. The hearing was less than a week away. The pressure was immense. Sarah watched him with growing concern. The stress of the fight, casting a pall over their home. "Is it worth it?" she asked one evening, as he hunched over the plat map on their dining room table. "This is consuming you. It's consuming us. Lily is asking why you're so angry all the time." The question struck him like a physical blow. He looked up from the map, his eyes tired. "If I let this go, I'm teaching our daughter that bullies win, that facts don't matter, that you should just give up what's yours to keep the peace. I can't do that. Sarah, this is about more than a garden." The day before the hearing, George called. His voice was electric with the thrill of discovery. "I've got it. Mark, I've got it all." They met back at the diner. George slid 2 sets of documents across the table. The first was a copy of the unredacted meeting minutes, which he had located in the town's Historical Society archive, just as he'd predicted. The blacked-out section was now crystal clear. The board had approved a new, exorbitant 5-year contract for common area beautification with a company called Holloway Lawn and Garden. A quick search of state business records confirmed George's suspicion the sole proprietor was a Mr. Robert Holloway, Brenda's brother-in-law. Brenda had not recused herself from the vote. She had championed the contract. "She's funneling HOA money to her family," Mark said, the pieces clicking into place. "The beautification project must be the justification for ripping out my garden. She creates a problem, then pays her brother-in-law a fortune to fix it." "That's the motive," George said, pushing the second document forward. "But this is the kill shot." It was a copy of an old deed, dated 1973, nearly 2 decades before Summit Creek existed. It was a deed of easement. Mark's eyes scanned the dense legal text until he found the key passage. The 6-foot-wide strip of land along his property, the area marked CUE on the plat map, was not an HOA view corridor. It was a county utility easement, granted by the original landowner to the county for the future installation and maintenance of water and sewer lines. Mark's mind reeled. The implications were staggering. "George," he said slowly, the words catching in his throat, "this means—" "It means," George finished, a grim smile on his face, "that the HOA has absolutely no jurisdiction over that land. None. They have no more authority there than they do in your living room. Their entire case, the violations, the fines, the hearing, it's all built on a foundation of fraud. This isn't just a mistake. Mark, this is a knowing, deliberate abuse of power." He had it. The smoking gun. The irrefutable proof that would not just end the fight, but expose the entire corrupt structure Brenda had built. He felt a surge of adrenaline. The hearing was tomorrow. He would walk in there, present the easement, and watch her reign crumble. Brenda, however, was a step ahead of him. She knew he was digging. Perhaps she'd heard about his visit to the county records office. Or maybe her paranoia had simply kicked into high gear. Sensing that she was losing her grip on the situation, she decided to escalate, to force his hand before he could make his move. The day of the hearing, Mark received an email not from Keystone, but from a law firm, Walters, Finch and Associates, legal counsel for the Summit Creek HOA. The email informed him that the evening's hearing was being postponed. In its place, the board had convened a special executive hearing, a closed-door session with no homeowners present, and had voted to proceed directly with placing a lien on his property. They were bypassing the public forum to accelerate the legal process, a clear violation of their own bylaws, requiring a homeowner hearing before such a vote could take place. The official lien notice would be filed with the county within 48 hours. The move was as brazen as it was desperate. She was trying to create a legal crisis for him, to bog him down in a title dispute that would be expensive and time-consuming to fight. All before the upcoming annual homeowners meeting, where he had planned to present his findings to the entire community. But she didn't stop there. Her attack became deeply, cruelly personal. She began targeting the one person in the community who had publicly shown him support, Mrs. Gable. Eleanor Gable was a widow in her late 70s, who lived 2 doors down from Mark and Sarah. She was a kind, gentle woman who had lived in her home for 40 years, long before the HOA existed. At the initial ACC meeting, where Brenda had ambushed Mark, Mrs. Gable had been the only one to speak up. "For goodness sake, Brenda," she had said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "It's a vegetable patch. The man is a good neighbor. Leave him be." Brenda had not forgotten the slight. The day after the lien notification, a Keystone Management truck was parked in front of Mrs. Gable's house. A compliance officer was walking her property with a clipboard. Within hours, 3 separate violation notices were posted to her door, one for a small, barely visible oil stain on her driveway, one for a patch of brown grass near her mailbox, and one for a single, dying rosebush in a garden she had lovingly tended for decades. The fines totaled $50 a day. For Mrs. Gable, who lived on a fixed income, it was a devastating blow. She called Mark in tears, clutching the notices in her hand. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "I've never had a violation in my life. They said if I don't replace the entire bush and pressure wash the driveway, they'll start fining me." Mark's fury was incandescent. This was no longer about a property line or HOA politics. Brenda was now using the full weight of the association to bully and extort a vulnerable senior citizen as a way to punish him. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to isolate him, to show the community the price of dissent. The next day, the final piece of her strategy fell into place. Mark received a call from Mr. Walters, the HOA's attorney. His tone was smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I'm calling on behalf of the board to propose a resolution. They are prepared to offer you a settlement." Mark listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "The board will agree to drop all fines against you, immediately halt the lien proceedings, and, as a gesture of goodwill, they will also forgive and rescind all pending violations against your neighbor, Mrs. Gable." Mark's heart hammered in his chest. It was the easy way out, protection for himself, and, more importantly, for the terrified Mrs. Gable. "What's the catch?" Mark asked, his voice low. "No catch, just a simple condition," the lawyer replied. "You will sign a standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. You will agree not to speak at the upcoming annual meeting or discuss this matter further with any residents. It's a clean slate for everyone, a private victory." There it was, the moral crossroads. Brenda was offering him a golden escape hatch, a way to save himself and rescue his elderly neighbor from her vindictive crusade. All he had to do was stay silent. All he had to do was let her corruption continue, to let her retain power, to let her do this to someone else in the future. He thought of Mrs. Gable, terrified and crying. He thought of his wife, worn down by the stress of the fight. But then he thought of Brenda's smug smile, of the redacted minutes, of the fraudulent claim built on lies. A private victory would feel like a public defeat. It would be an abdication of responsibility to the entire community she held hostage. "No," Mark said, the word coming out with a clarity that surprised even him. "There will be no settlement." He hung up the phone. He had made his choice. This would not end in a quiet, confidential agreement. It would end in the light, in front of everyone. He would protect Mrs. Gable not by accepting a deal with the devil, but by destroying the devil's entire kingdom. The Summit Creek annual homeowners meeting was Brenda Holloway's coronation. It was the one night a year she could stand before the entire community, flanked by her loyal board members, and recount her administration's triumphs, the new petunias at the front gate, the successful negotiation of a cheaper garbage contract, the rising property values that were, she always implied, a direct result of her vigilant leadership. This year, the atmosphere in the clubhouse was different. The air was thick with tension. Whispers about the Callaway dispute, the lien, and the sudden flurry of violations against old Mrs. Gable had circulated through the neighborhood's email chains and cul-de-sac gossip networks. More than 100 homeowners packed the room, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and apprehension. They weren't here for a lecture on petunias. They were here for a showdown. Mark and Sarah arrived early, taking seats in the back row. Mark carried a simple black binder. Beside them sat George Maxwell and a tearful but resolute Mrs. Gable. Mark had paid for the pressure washing of her driveway and had a landscaper coming tomorrow to replace the rosebush. But he had urged her to be here tonight. They need to see who she's really hurting. He'd told her gently. Brenda, oblivious or indifferent to the mood, began the meeting with her usual self-congratulatory speech. But when she opened the floor for the homeowner forum, the part of the meeting where residents could air their grievances, her smile tightened. She knew this was the main event. "Each speaker will be limited to 5 minutes, she announced, gesturing to a large digital timer projected on the screen next to the HOA logo. "This is to ensure everyone has a chance to be heard. First on the list, Mark Callaway." A hush fell over the room as Mark walked to the podium at the front. He placed his binder on the lectern and looked out at the faces of his neighbors. Then he glanced at Brenda, who sat at the head table, shuffling papers with an air of practiced boredom. The timer on the screen glowed red 5:05. "Good evening," Mark began, his voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. He did not look angry. He did not sound emotional. He sounded like an architect presenting a structural analysis. "My name is Mark Callaway, and I live at 1280 Summit View Drive. For the past 6 weeks, I, and by extension, my family, have been the subject of a targeted campaign of harassment by this board. And I am here tonight to present the facts." The timer clicked to 4:50. "I have prepared a packet of documents for everyone. Sarah is handing them out now." As he spoke, Sarah and George moved through the aisles, distributing slim packets of paper. Homeowners began to murmur as they flipped through the pages. "If you'll turn to page 1, Mark continued, his tone measured and precise, "you will see the initial notice of violation I received, citing a breach of CC&R Section 8.4.2 regarding an unobstructed community view corridor. Now, if you please turn to page 2, you will see the official Summit Creek plat map. As you can see, Section 8.4.2, by its own definition within the CC&Rs, applies only to the designated scenic easement lots on the western side of the community. My property is on the eastern side, from the very beginning. The bylaw used against me was misapplied, a fact the board was fully aware of. The timer hit 3:30. Brenda's hand had stopped shuffling papers. This leads to the question of motive. Mark went on. Why would the board knowingly pursue a false violation? Please turn to page 3. On the left is a copy of the board meeting minutes I received, with a large section concerning landscaping contracts redacted for so-called vendor privacy. On the right is the unredacted version of the same page, obtained from the public record. It shows the board approving a lucrative new contract for a company called HOA Lawn and Garden, owned by the president's brother-in-law. The purpose of this contract was the beautification and remediation of the very common area they were trying to seize. They were manufacturing a problem in order to pay a family member to solve it with your money. Gasps rippled through the room. A man in the front row shouted, "Is this true?" Brenda. She stared straight ahead, her face a pale, rigid mask. The timer showed 1:15. But the fraud goes even deeper, Mark said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. The board's entire case is built on the claim that the strip of land my garden sits on is HOA common area. This is the most critical fact of all. Please turn to the final page. Page 4. The room was filled with the rustle of paper. This is a copy of a deed of easement, filed with this county in 1973. It proves, beyond any doubt, that the 6-foot strip of land in question is neither my private property nor HOA common area. It is, and always has been, a county utility easement. The Summit Creek HOA has zero legal jurisdiction over it. They have no more right to fine me for a fence there than they do to fine you for the color of your car parked on a public street. He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. For 6 weeks, he said, his voice now ringing with cold, righteous anger. This board, led by President Holloway, has knowingly enforced bylaws on land they do not control. They have levied thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines. They have paid their own family with HOA funds. They have threatened my home with a lien. And when a kind, elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, spoke out, they targeted her with frivolous violations to silence her. He gestured toward Mrs. Gable, who looked up, her eyes filled with tears. The timer on the screen read 0:10. Mark looked directly at Brenda. This wasn't about a view corridor. It was about power, greed, and retaliation. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated, malicious fraud perpetrated against a member of this community. The timer flashed 0:00. Mark stood in silence. The room was deathly quiet for a beat. And then it erupted. The chaos was immediate and absolute. The simmering tension in the room boiled over into a tidal wave of homeowner fury. Shouts of shame and resign were directed at the head table. A woman stood up, waving her evidence packet. "I want to see the books. I want a full audit. Right now." Brenda Holloway sat frozen, her face ashen. The carefully constructed artifice of her authority had been publicly and systematically dismantled in less than 5 minutes. The other board members, her loyal lieutenants, began to distance themselves, physically inching their chairs away from hers as if her corruption were contagious. One of them, a man named Tom, held up his hands. I had no idea about the easement. We were just following Brenda's lead." From the back of the room, a clear voice cut through the noise. It was George. "I make a motion from the floor to immediately censure the board of directors for gross malfeasance and to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. Seconded, yelled a dozen voices at once. Before Brenda could even attempt to rule the motion out of order, the representative from Keystone Management. David shot to his feet. His face was pale with panic. He was not a party to the board's corruption, but his company was now neck-deep in liability. "On behalf of Keystone Management," he announced, his voice strained, "we will be formally recommending that the board immediately vote to rescind all fines and legal actions against Mr. Calloway and Mrs. Gable, effective immediately. We will also be launching a full internal review of our own oversight procedures." He was saving himself, throwing Brenda and her board under the bus before the bus could be set on fire. The motion to censure and audit passed with a thunderous, near-unanimous roar of "Aye." Brenda didn't even call for the nays. Her reign was over. She stared blankly at the angry faces of the neighbors she once ruled, her expression one of utter disbelief. The system she had expertly manipulated for her own gain had just been turned against her with devastating precision. In the ensuing uproar, Mark, Sarah, George, and Mrs. Gable quietly slipped out of the clubhouse. The night air was cool and clean. Mrs. Gable hugged Mark tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me my voice back." Mark felt a profound sense of release, the crushing weight of the past 6 weeks lifting from his shoulders. He hadn't just won a dispute, he had liberated a community. The fallout was swift and decisive. A special election was called, and, in a landslide vote, Brenda Holloway and her 2 remaining allies on the board were recalled. The forensic audit uncovered years of questionable contracts and budgetary sleight of hand, all tracing back to Brenda's tenure as president. Holloway Lawn and Garden was forced to repay tens of thousands of dollars to the HOA, facing potential civil and even criminal charges for fraud. Brenda and her husband quietly put their house on the market and left Summit Creek. The era of the clipboard queen was officially over. A new reform-minded board was elected. They immediately offered Mark a seat, but he politely declined. "I'm an architect, not a politician," he told them, "but I'd be happy to help you build a better foundation." He spent the next several weeks working with them as a consultant, helping draft a new set of bylaws focused on transparency, accountability, and due process. They instituted mandatory public disclosure of all contracts, established a clear and independent appeals process for violations, and rewrote the rules to protect homeowners from the kind of arbitrary power Brenda had wielded. He had fixed the broken system. Life returned to a peaceful, new normal. The garden thrived. Lily's painted sign, once a symbol of defiance, was now just a cheerful marker for their family's patch of earth. The daily fines and threatening letters were a fading memory. One rainy Saturday afternoon, months later, Sarah was cleaning out the home office. She came across an old accordion file labeled Summit Creek Clubhouse Bid, 2013. "Mark, come look at this," she called out, her voice puzzled. He walked into the study. She had 2 large architectural proposals spread across his desk. One was from his firm, Calloway and Associates. The clean, elegant, and cost-effective design that had won them the contract to build the community clubhouse over a decade ago. The other was a far more grandiose and expensive proposal, full of ostentatious columns and superfluous flourishes. It had been the runner-up, rejected by the developer's selection committee. Mark looked at the name printed in the title block of the rejected bid, Holloway Designs, Inc., Principal Architect, Brenda Holloway. He stared at the document, and, in a flash of stunning clarity, the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. This wasn't about a garden. It wasn't even about the landscaping contract, or a simple lust for power. It was about a decade-old professional slight, a festering wound to her ego that had never healed. Every time she stepped into that clubhouse, she was walking into a monument of her own failure, a building designed by the man who had beaten her. His quiet, Peaceful existence on the edge of her domain had been a constant, unbearable reminder of her rejection. The little garden fence on the contested property line wasn't the cause of her vendetta. It was simply the excuse she had been waiting 10 years to find. Mark looked out the window at the quiet, manicured street. The system was in place. The bully was gone, and the peace was restored. But he now understood, with a chilling certainty, that the most dangerous structures are not built of wood and stone. They are built of pride, resentment, and a long-held grudge. Their foundations buried so deep, you never see them until the whole world starts to shake.